Hi, good evening, and welcome to Rainbow Arch, in which we discuss culture and society. So, what we are going to discuss today is the second episode or the sequel to the one we had on Gulzar last week. We are lucky to have Pawan Jha with us. Pawan is somebody who I call the chief Gulzarologist of India. So he's been terribly busy with personal work both last week and this week, so he had to skip last week, but this week he's been kind enough to join us just in time. So I'll spend the next couple of minutes perhaps introducing the topic or sort of trying to begin from where we left off last week. So, to sketch the context, the big question I've been trying to ask is well, why is Gulzar so successful commercially in a world where poets are not traditionally successful? So let me sketch out the context. In general, poets are not supposed to be commercially successful. Poetry is often a lonely pursuit. Otherwise, there are poets who are respected, who win awards and do all sorts of critically acclaimed things, but they're not cult figures in the sense of being popular and the kind of books people sell or the kind of crowds they pull. So Gulzar is very, very special for us. So that's what we are focusing on. And the big issue is that he's not simply a Bollywood lyricist. He's a poet in his own right. He's a writer. He's a director. Maybe his multifarious, many splendored character does play a good role. And as we discussed last week, even his white kurtas, starched kurtas, might have added to the mystique. But let's cut all that out. The fact is that he's a poet and he's a successful commercial poet. Now, what makes him different from other lyricists, with the possible exception of somebody like Sahir Ludhianvi, we'll come to that, is that other lyricists are either simply not that popular the way Gulzar is, or when they are, when they are poets like Gopal Das, Neeraj, or Bharat Vyas, they are sort of respected in some elite circles or knowledgeable circles. They are not mass figures, they are not cult figures. So Gulzar is special for that reason. We have Tanveer Singh remarking that Sampuran Singh, which is of course Gulzar's real name, is a polymath. That's a good point, of course. And then Javed Akhtar is popular, says Kanika, but I must, Kanika, very cheekily remark that Javed Saab doesn't quite match up to Gulzar in the cult following he has. And also, Javed Saab is a shair in a mushaira sense of the term. He doesn't have that many published works with a cult following. We are quibbling, of course. But anyway, so we'll come to Pawan in a moment. The point I was trying to make was that.
Yes, I'm in. Okay, so any point in a couple of minutes?
Yeah. I'll hold on for a couple of minutes, Pawan. Then you'll do all the talking because you are the special guest today. Okay. So essentially, Gulzar is, in my opinion, popular for three reasons. That is what I am zeroing in on. More than critical acclaim, more than the fact that he's a polymath, is the fact that he's a poet who has three great things going for him, which is what makes him commercially successful. First is that his words are quite simple and therefore accessible to all. Therefore, he has that simplicity. Now, Sahir Ludhianvi also had that character, but Sahir has a standing probably even more than Gulzar in some longer term sense. But then Sahir was more a socialist poet who was also backed by a political movement because he became a sort of anthem writer for the left-wing movement of India. Therefore, he has a political flavor, whereas Gulzar is known for his romance, is for his observations on life, on everything. So that makes him a more poet in the sense of somebody who's not a demagogue, but is respected. So that brings me, as I said, let me sum it up before I bring in Pawan. 3 points. One is that his words are very simple, therefore intelligible and accessible to all. The second thing I want to say is that this is what I mentioned last week. He is brings out the poet in the listener in talking with the stream of consciousness, or in talking about feelings, even on things like having an NRI relatives visiting in. He has a certain middle class quality. So, what I say is three things: simple words, and he brings out the poet in the person who's listening in a way where the listener feels as if he or she herself could have written that. So he brings out the poet in the person. And the third thing is that he arrives at a time when India had an increasingly affluent middle class, which with a poetic bent of mind. So he's, in a Marxist sense, you could call him a bourgeois poet, but then he's also respected in the sense he's not political at all, although he's made political movies of sorts, but he's a bit of an aloof thing. So that's what makes him very special. Now let me bring in Pawan, who runs Gulzar online. He's a close friend and confidant of Gulzar Sahib, and above all, probably knows him inside out. So I'd love to hear some lines quoted by Pawan, as well as his views on why he thinks Gulzar is commercially successful. There are so many ways we can discuss this poet, but here we're going to focus on what makes him tick commercially and in a popular sense.
Yeah. Thank you,
Pawan?
Madhavan, for the invite, and especially when you know some person with such a close distance, it is very difficult to talk about him. Especially the kind of ocean that opens up in front of you, and you never know what कि कौन से सिरे से शुरू करें which, लेकिन ये जरूर है कि कोई भी सिरा जहां जा मिला वहीं तुम मिलोगे. तो एनीथिंग मतलब इट इज वेरी वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू
इन रेशमी राहों में ये राह तो कोई होगी जो उन तक पहुंचती है
जी
गुलजार तक.
जी जी. So it is very very difficult to define Gulzar, because he's not just a name or a person or an artist. I believe he actually identifies, or you can personify him as an ideology, and it is something which takes his art, the flight of his art, beyond the prison of you can say the traditional foundations, and gives it a free flow of a complete a bigger sky. But on the other hand, somewhere it is so much rooted, it is as much as connected with the roots and the जो उसकी ज़मीन है, it never forgets that. So the canvas that Gulzar has as an artist, which is as traditional as he can, as well as modern he could. So it's a perfect balance. He creates a beautiful, you can say, a rainbow of shades of his arts in between that the roots and the skies that he gives, because he somewhere has that courage to break those traditional norms, to make films from his sensibilities and conviction, to write poetry as per his understanding and as per his sensibility, rather than fitting to the medium. So somewhere I feel what makes Gulzar different from a lot of other people, that he like Nida Fazli has once said कि हर आदमी में होते हैं 10-20 आदमी जिसे भी देखना कई बार देखना. तो गुलजार साहब में I have seen more than a couple of dozens of people, because whether it's an artist, whether it's a person, whether it's a human side of it, he never stops to surprise you. He keeps surprising you every day with them, and somewhere there's an avid learner in behind each of these facets, because I have seen him. He's 87 and he's still learning. He's such a good learner of things, of new craft, of technology. He has written his first novel at the age of 83. Can you imagine? And just
Interesting.
last
I
year,
think,
when the
Pawan, you
COVID.
hit the nail. You hit the nail. Let me say something very, very interesting, Pawan. Let me sum up in my own words what you said just now.
Yeah,
Two
yeah,
things very important. One is that Gulzar is both traditional and modern, and in that sense, it makes him very eternal.
Yeah,
The other thing you mentioned, which is fascinating, is that he's evolving still at the age of 87. It's a
yeah,
very interesting point because long ago I heard that one way to distinguish a major poet from a minor poet is that when you read a new poem by a major poet, you can say which is the new one, which is the old one, because you can
yeah.
see the soul's evolution in the major
Absolutely,
poet. And
absolutely.
that Gulzar is a living example. And
And
the fact that he makes language malleable.
yeah,
He's not a Puritan in language,
yeah.
and in the process he develops the language itself.
Absolutely, and he also makes a point that this ghazal I wrote in 1987, but when I write it back in 2017 or 2019, I would have a different. I would be a different artist. I would be a different person. So I would extend it. So none of my work is a complete one or a finished one. It is ever evolving piece of work. Each poem of his is actually he keeps evolving even his old poems. And one very specific reason why he's so different from Sahir or Shailendra or Majru or the other film based artists or poets, that he actually is so many persons in one person. He's a director, he's a story writer, he's a dialogue writer, he's a filmmaker, he's a producer, and he's a narrator. But at the soul of it, at the core of it, the driver of each and every facet of his is a poet. The
Mhm.
sensibilities that he carries as a poet, that reflects in his works as a screenwriter, that reflects as his work as a director, because I call him a poetic director, yeah, because you can find those poetic sensibilities in his directions, in his stories, in his dialogues. If you see a film like Ijazat, every dialogue is a poetry. And at the other hand, the the director in him actually drives the poet, actually gives the visual images to the poet Gulzar. So somewhere the poet Gulzar is very visual. The kind of imagery he draws is exceptional, is quite different
Yeah,
from what other
exactly.
people have done.
Pawan, I'd like you to stop there because I want to say something very interesting. Because
So,
Tanveer Singh remarks that the poetic tool used by Gulzar is synesthesia. And I'm saying this at this juncture because synesthesia is a neuroscience concept in which
absolutely.
people tend to see colors as words, or they sort of the wall between
Yeah.
words and colors and sounds vanishes in a pure consciousness, and that's why I think his imagery is part of that. And last week only I was mentioning how he talks about mera o saman lota do,
Yes, yes,
where
yes.
he's talking about a time as a thing. So
Absolutely.
he kind of like a blockchain NFT being carved out of
Yeah. Yeah.
a tweet. He
Yeah.
freezes a moment and converts it into a thing where the analogy of the scientific mind meets the metaphor of the poetic heart. And
Absolutely.
together it creates a freezing impact in the listener, which
Yeah.
is what I say brings out the poet in the listener.
And somewhere you actually see him reaching those places where you would not imagine without a proper study. For example, just yesterday I was discussing an album called Dil Padosi Hai, and the title or song of that is an exemplary, you can say, thing from a European philosophy called existentialism.
Existentialism.
And there are certain themes that are drawn from existentialism, and that song is a perfect example of alienation in the existentialism. So somewhere, without having a proper background or a proper reading, he somewhere has that knack to reach to those places where you feel people reach after having spent a complete life. So malab, you find, I was discussing with him about this. There is a recent discovery about a lot of new galaxies, billions of galaxies, by the Hubble telescope of NASA, and in August month only, they have released some photos taken by Hubble which showcases a lot of galaxies like us, and that in within that frame you can identify that there are hundreds and billions of galaxies like us in the universe. It's a new finding, but somewhere the poet Gulzar has already reached there, or even our poets have already reached there. So it is their sensibility and imagery, it is their flight, that somewhere they reach to that particular places where science will take some time to reach.
Pawan, you make me say Gulzar is the one who kind of conveys that today's poetry is tomorrow's science. Even
Yeah,
synesthesia falls into that
yeah, yeah,
very
yeah,
interesting point
absolutely.
because, in fact, I've had a discussion with a neuroscientist, Dr. Ramachandran, who's done some great
Yeah,
work on synesthesia.
yeah.
And this is very, very fascinating how the human brain responds. But the point is, at the soul level, we already know something which the brain takes a long while to know, and even more than that is for the world to know through experiments and observations. And that's where
Gee.
I think the science connects with art somewhere in Gulzarisms. um,
Yeah,
now we
and
have,
another very important aspect of his creativity is the kind of connect he has in the generations. The way well, he connects to the generation of my father, and the way he connects to the generation of my son. That canvas is amazing, because the kind of sensibilities he carries somewhere, that old muhavra in his poetry has that connect to the nostalgia, but his poetic sensibilities has a very very strange and very strong impact on the current generation, especially a film like
Pawan,
Ijazat has. Yeah,
it's time to just stop and wonder how the same man who wrote प्यार कोई बोल नहीं प्यार आवाज नहीं, hmm, also wrote चड्डी पहन के फूल खिला है.
absolutely. And I'll tell you, there was a
Is that
film
correct? Yeah.
called Blue Umbrella, and Blue Umbrella had a song in the very beginning. I was seeing that film on the DVD and with my father, and suddenly my father told me that this song what he has written कि वो घर घर में चंदा लेने जाते हैं, एंड मेरा टेसू यहीं अड़ा खाने को मांगे दही बड़ा. तो माय फादर टोल्ड मी that in the early 1950s, they used to go to Delhi lanes and to take the donations for the Ravan and the Dashera by singing the same song. So he brings that 1950s to us, but also the kind of sensibilities, the futuristic sensibilities he brings for the current generation, it is exceptional. Especially in films like Jhoom Barabar Jhoom or Bunty or Bubbly, the way he connects to the generation of the millennials, it is exceptional. I've rarely seen anyone connecting to those.
In fact,
He acts like a bridge.
I mentioned this last week, Pawan, saying that he's not just an artist, he's a communicator. There's a difference between an artist. Artist तो सिर्फ इजहार करता है, जबकि only says what is in his or her own mind, whereas Gulzar reaches out into the minds almost consciously, because he's not on an ego trip. He's actually sensitive. And in that sense, he doesn't have the vanity of the artist who usually write only for appreciation. He writes for communication. I think that is very
Absolutely, and
special.
I'll tell you a very interesting personal experience. It is Delhi only, Indian Habitat Center. There was a session with Kedarnath Singh ji, who was a renowned Hindi poet. It was a forum called Samanvay, on languages, and there is a very specific habit of Gulzar Sahab, that he always reaches his events almost 15 minutes to half an hour earlier, because there have been times when I have gone with him, and we have reached to the event place when we find only the tent people who are actually managing the tents, and there's no sight of organizers. So he has a tendency to reach places earlier, to especially to events. And on that day, on the Samanvay day, Gulzar Sahab actually reached the destination event almost half an hour back, and I was with him, and we sat for a session which was going on on the Khasi language, which was a northeastern language, and we had absolutely no idea what the people were talking about. But suddenly he heard a name, a very young poet who was in the panel of the previous session. He was a Khasi poet from Northeast, and suddenly he asked me, "What did the what was his name?" Because we didn't know the panel by faces, or they were not very renowned poets. So I could not get it. But when the session ended, they announced the name again, and suddenly Gulzar Sahab was so excited, and he went to the stage to meet that guy. "Oh, you are that poet. I have translated one of your poems." And he was a legend, 85-year-old legend, who's talking to a 27-year-old poet, that with such an excitement कि मतलब मैंने आपका पोएम ट्रांसलेट किया है, मैं आपसे पहले कभी नहीं मिला हूँ, एक बार ईमेल कभी हुआ होगा, but I saw that kind of excitement and respect for the newer generation, for the people of different craft and creativity and मतलब of the same you feel, but the kind of respect he has for all the people is exceptional.
Very interesting. And lots of interesting comments coming in. Pavan, of course, lots of appreciation for your ability to analyze and explain so beautifully. And Tanvir says there is some innocence in the first song in his he wrote, Mora Gora Anglele. Like I said, the innocence and simplicity with the deep interest in everything from science to profound existentialist philosophy is what makes him very special and sort of ageless. And I think that is a point that we didn't cover last week, which I'm glad Pavan has managed to bring forth so beautifully today.
I would
And
I
I
would
think
also give one more example. His methodology for the research. He recently had to give one award on literature, and especially for Marathi literature and Hindi literature. This was just a couple of years ago, and he actually he was not aware of the works of the poets, so he got all those works just to deliver that keynote speech for those people. And he went and met those people before the function so that he could actually highlight the persona and the creativity of those people. So he actually went to all the people who he had to spoke on, and he had to deliver a speech for. He just had to give a keynote address and an award to those people, but he went to that he went to those places actually to prepare for that. That is exceptional.
let, let me put it in my own style. That he is a poet of affections rather than affectations, because affectations are very common for celebrities, and whereas he's known more for showing up early for his own performance is a classic example of the simplicity which he also shows in language. That's because simplicity of language can come only when you either are simple yourself, which is not, or where you're complex but so simplicity, sensitive that you go out of your way to be simple. That's like Einstein, who once said, after writing the more complex relativity theory, ends up saying all truly great things are simple. Today's session is about the fact that there is more to Gulzar than the
Yeah,
romantic poet that overshadows the political side or the other sides of Gulzar. He is, in a sense, the opposite of Amitabh Bachchan. Amitabh Bachchan is known as the angry young man, but we also know that there are other movies of his like Anand and Jurmana and Barsat Ki Ek Raat, जिसमें he played, a
yeah,
sensitive person.
yeah,
Gulzar is the opposite. There is an angry young man, or at least an upset young man, or a considerate young man with a political side that is hidden under the more romantic, soft-sounding Gulzar. So Gulzar often probably is here to show that you don't have to be loud to be radical. But mere, frankly, Pravan, I don't know much about this side of
yeah,
Gulzar.
yeah.
I'm blaming it on propaganda machine, which is focusing only on one side of his persona or personality. So I would wait to hear from you. Let me begin by
Sure.
saying that the song that I felt very political from Gulzar was Mere Apne Hal Chal Tik Tak Hai, which was
Yeah,
actually made in the big inflation era of Roti Kapda or Makan. And the oil shock of 1973 in Israel, Israel's war with Arab, which affected everybody. So BA किया है, MA किया, लगता है
Yeah,
वो भी ME
yeah,
किया, was
yeah.
about unemployment, and that movie was the Gangs of Wasseypur of its times, which produced many great actors, including Dinesh
Yeah.
Thakur, Shatrughan Sinha, and
Yes,
Vinod
yes,
Khanna.
yes. Yeah,
God knows how many, and that was a political movie, and it
yeah,
was a Gulzar movie. So
absolutely.
people, uh, so let's begin there, Pawan. My
Yeah.
knowledge of this
So,
is very
yeah,
little. आप चलिए, आप please
yeah,
illustrate a few examples of the
yeah,
political
yeah,
side of
yeah.
Gulzar.
So I'll actually try to cover a larger journey or the larger canvas, especially to discuss the political side of Gulzar. Actually, as we know, Gulzar is known for the Rumaniyat in his poetry or for exploration of human relationships. But today,
Mm-hmm.
it's a totally a different facet of his creativity as a writer, where we see him as a social activist as well as a political commentator, where one can see him writing between the lines or beneath the surface. And it's another dimension of him where one can see him angry at times, in anguish or pain for the state of affairs of last 70 years, having an unusual satirical tone on the journey of the nation, for being an eyewitness to a very from a very close distance to breaking of a nation into two and then building of a nation for last 70 years. So somewhere I have always seen a darker side in Gulzar's poetry, but I've always seen a very brighter side of an optimistic guy who is very positive for tomorrow. He's always very enthusiastic about our achievements and always carry a ray of hope, even when commenting on the complete darkness of the state of affairs. So
Mm-hmm.
I have picked three poems, which is kind of a template where he actually shows us both the sides alive. Like there's a poem called "Hindustan में दो दो हिंदुस्तान है."
एक
So
minute, Pawan. I would wait for you. I want to make a small interjection.
sure,
I also know Sahir Ludhianvi as a poet, and there can be no mention of political poetry without mentioning Sahir.
yes,
But you mentioned something very interesting because
yeah,
Sahir's poems are not really optimistic.
yeah,
Even songs like Fir Subah Kabhi To
yeah,
Aayegi
yeah, yeah,
is more, although the words are optimistic, the tone of the poetry is not optimistic.
yeah, yeah,
But Gulzar is an eternal optimist. In that sense, he is not political in a in your face negative
yeah,
sense.
absolutely,
उनके प्रोटेस्ट में भी आधा है. So
yeah.
please go on, Pawan. Let's
Yeah.
wait to hear
So,
about it.
so, so I'll quote a poem which is very favorite of mine. हिंदुस्तान में दो दो हिंदुस्तान दिखाई देते हैं, एक है
Mm-hmm.
जिसका सर 10वें बादल में है. मीन्स जब व्हेन इंडिया रीच टू द मार्स मिशन एंड जो अचीवमेंट्स हैं, और एक है
Cloud nine.
दूसरा जिसका पाम अभी दलदल में है, वेयर ही स्पीकिंग अबाउट द अंडर प्रिविलेज एंड द ऑपरेस क्लास. एक है जो सतरंगी थाम के उठता है, दूसरा
वाह.
पैर उठाता है तो रुकता है. फिरका
Mm-hmm.
परस्ती, वहम परस्ती और गरीबी की रेखाएं. एक है दौड़ लगाने को तैयार खड़ा है, अग्नि पर सर रख कर पांव उड़ जाने को तैयार खड़ा है. लेकिन वो
वाह.
एंड करते हैं कि हिंदुस्तान उम्मीद से है, चलो चलें,
हाँ.
जो तुम चलो तो हिंदुस्तान चले. वेयर मतलब ही सेज कि इट इज नॉट ओनली द पॉलिटिक्स और द गवर्नेंस विच कैन ड्राइव द नेशन टू दैट ब्राइटर साइड, बट इट इज ऑल्सो द पीपल ऑफ द नेशन, जो जब तक वो कंट्रीब्यूट नहीं करेंगे तब तक हम शायद वो उसको अचीव नहीं कर पाए. एक और उनकी पोएम है जो बहुत खूबसूरत है, मुझे बहुत
वेरी
पसंद है.
इंटरेस्टिंग.
वो
वन सेकेंड बिफोर यू गो
हाँ,
टू द नेक्स्ट पोएम. मुझे
हाँ,
इसमें बहुत अच्छी बात लगी कि इमेजरी बहुत अच्छी है, और एट
जी,
द सेम टाइम आई थिंक इट्स वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट टू अंडरस्टैंड कि ये प्रोबेबली फिल्मी पोएम नहीं है ना?
नहीं नहीं,
तो
बट दिस
अपनी
वाज
शक्ति
यूज्ड
है.
एज अ विजुअल, या फॉर द विजुअल मीडियम. मतलब एक
हाँ.
कैंपेन था उसके लिए हिंदुस्तान के देयर वाज सम सेलिब्रेशन, तो उसके ऊपर कैंपेन था, शायद 70 इयर्स के ऊपर दिस
अच्छा
वाज.
अच्छा, वेरी गुड.
Yeah.
गो ऑन.
But there was another poem which is for a film, which was actually used in a film, which is a brilliant poem. कि जरा सा आओ ना, बैठो, वतन की बात करें. जरा सा आओ ना, बैठो, वतन की बात करें. उम्मीदें डूब गई जो निगल निगल के भंवर, उम्मीदें हाफ रही है जो बादबानों में, उम्मीद और शौक के कत्लो गबन की बात करें, कि जो प्रोमिसेस थे एक इंडिया की जर्नी में पिछले इतने साल के, कि इंडिपेंडेंस के बाद, आजादी के बाद एक खुशहाली आएगी, एक सोशलिज्म एक किस्म का इक्वल वो आएगा स्टेचर, लेकिन उन उम्मीदें, वो जो उम्मीदें डूब गई हैं उनकी बात करें। और वो कहते हैं कि 50 सालों में ऐसा नहीं कि कुछ ना हुआ, मतलब इंडिया इंडिपेंडेंट होने के बाद फलक खुला तो गिरी धूप जैसे गर्द गिरे, हर एक रोज फलक पहुंचा उठ के साफ किया, हमारे पैरों पे कुल्हाड़ियां गिरी लेकिन लहू लुहान कदम सीढ़ियों पे चढ़ते रहे, निकल तो आए हैं घुटनों घुटनों दलदल से, अभी खुला नहीं कैसे चमन की बात करें। मतलब हम लोगों को इंडिपेंडेंस मिली है, बहुत प्रोग्रेस की है हमने, लेकिन फिर भी जिस इंडिया की हमने सोचा था उसकी वो हम वहां नहीं पहुंचे हैं। तो वो फिर कहते हैं कि चलो ना चलते चलें और वतन की बात करें, जरा सा आओ ना वतन की बात करें। ये एक फिल्म थी लाल सलाम, उसमें ये गीत रिकॉर्ड किया था रूप कुमार राठौड़ के साथ। और एक गीत लता जी का बहुत खूबसूरत है जो उन्होंने फिल्म हुतुतु के लिए लिखा था, और उसमें देखिए कितनी बड़ी बात आ जाती है हिंदुस्तान के लिए।
एक छोटी सी टिप्पणी करना चाहूंगा। फैज, यू मेंशन्ड दिस होल लाइंस एंड वो मुझे फैज के लाइंस आ गए ना, ये जो इंतजार था जिसका वो ये शहर तो नहीं।
जी जी।
तो वो
और मुझे
एक हो रहा है
जी, और सॉरी, और मुझे कहीं दुष्यंत की शेड भी नजर आती है कि वो
अच्छा।
कितने मुनासिब हैं ये लोग सफर के लिए, कि हाथ वो उसमें सने हैं कुल्हाड़ियों में। तो वो शेड भी यहाँ पर कहीं एक बहुत खूबसूरत एक वो हिंदुस्तान की आवाम के लिए शेड है। लेकिन जो गीत मुझे बहुत पसंद है, लता जी की आवाज में विशाल ने कंपोज किया है, वो है जय हिंद हिंद। गुरु मंत्र मेरा, इतिहास मेरा, तहजीब मेरी, विश्वास मेरा। कैसे वो हिंदुस्तान को डिस्क्राइब करते हैं कि गुरु मंत्र मेरा, इतिहास मेरा, तहजीब मेरी, विश्वास मेरा, मेरी कर्म भूमि मेरी जन्म भूमि, ये हिंदू है हिंदुस्तान मेरा। कर्म भूमि भी है और जन्म भूमि भी है। क्यों ये नेशनलिज्म की यहाँ पे बात आती है, लेकिन वहीं पे वो दूसरी साइड लेके आते हैं बहुत खूबसूरत जय, कि ये देश घना बरगद है मेरा, बरगद की घनी छांव के तले मेरी फाख्ता दाना चुगती रहे, मेरे लोक गीत का तोता पले। दिस इज द ऑप्टिमिस्टिक साइड, कि इस देश की सारी धूप मेरी, इस देश की सारी छांव मेरी, नदियों का सारा पानी मेरा, हरियाली गांव गांव मेरी, पर भूख मेरी, बीमारी मेरी, जाती नहीं क्यों बेकारी मेरी। जब भी कोई सूरज उगता है हर बार ग्रहण लग जाता है, आकाश मेरा भर जाए तो कोई मेघ चुरा ले जाता है, सम्मान मेरा ये विरसा मेरा, लौटा दो मुझे ये हिस्सा मेरा। मतलब कि वो अवाम को वो नहीं मिला जो हमें उम्मीदें थी 70 साल के हिंदुस्तान से। आज भी हम उन्हीं चीजों के लिए लड़ रहे हैं, उन्हीं चीजों को, और इसमें कहीं ना कहीं उस पॉलिटिक्स का बहुत योगदान है। तो ये एक बहुत बड़े लेवल पे हिंदुस्तान की पिछले 70 साल की जर्नी पे उनका एक कमेंट है जो सिनेमा में भी आता है और सिनेमा के बाहर भी आता है।
वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग। मेरे दो बातें याद आई। एक तो है कि इसमें हिंदी अच्छी छलकती है उनकी, नॉर्मली उर्दू बायस दिखाया जाता है, इसमें उनकी हिंदी बायस है जो भारत व्यास और प्रदीप की तरह एक नेशनलिस्ट स्पिरिट को कैप्चर करती है। एट द सेम टाइम वो रोसियाइड नहीं है एक तरह से, मतलब इन पाँव गरीबों के दलदल में होंगे मगर इनके पाँव जो है जमीन में ही है। So he doesn't get carried away by his optimism. So in he's an optimistically realist.
Yeah, and he doesn't get carried away from the occasion also, because he recited the same poem in the parliament, joint parliamentary session to Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha people, and on the occasion of 150 years of that first 1857 independence wala jo moment tha. So, but he actually presented both the sides, where we are still waiting for that सुबह to happen. वो सुबह कभी, अभी भी हम उस सुबह का इंतजार कर रहे हैं। तो वो डेफिनेटली, लेकिन मैं अपनी बात का पहला हिस्सा सिर्फ एक कमेंट के साथ अभी रुकूंगा कि हम बात आपने मेरे अपने से शुरू की थी, बट मेरे अपने इज सो मच ऑफ पॉलिटिकल बियॉन्ड हालचाल ठीक ठाक है ऑल्सो, बिकॉज हालचाल ठीक ठाक है इज जस्ट अ स्टेटमेंट ऑन the unemployment and the statement of youth, but somewhere it is a bigger comment on the grassroots of the politics, the student politics. and how
Exactly.
student power and energy is exploited by the vested interest of politics, and how that is an originating point of a journey to the core of politics. एंड सबसे बड़ी बात, जो सबसे मजेदार बात है कि
Just
उसमें जो
1 minute, I want to
मेजर,
say, ये मेरे अपने में उन्होंने टेम्पलेट बना दिया स्टूडेंट
जी
पॉलिटिक्स को लेट
जी
बाद बाद में सुधीर मिश्रा मेड ये वो
जी
शहर
जी
तो
जी
नहीं,
जी जी
एंड ऑल्सो हासिल बनाया था तिग्मांशु दुलिया ने,
जी
तो ये टेम्पलेट गुलजार का ही रहा है, ऑल्दो
जी
तपन सिन्हा ने ओरिजिनल
जी जी
बंगाली में बनाया।
और उसमें जो सबसे अच्छी बात है कि उसमें वो जो दो पॉलिटिकल प्रोटोगोनिस्ट लेके आते हैं जो एक्सपीरियंस्ड हैं, एक अनोखे लाले हैं और एक ब्लाकी प्रसाद हैं, महमूद और हसन, वो दोनों, ही हैज मेड इट कैरिकेचरिश। तो
हर्ष,
लेकिन आप पिछले 50 साल के, अगर आप जितने हम लोगों को देखते हैं पॉलिटिक्स में, तो उसमें बहुत कुछ हमें दिखता है कि वो एक्चुअल रियलिज्म है वहां पर। जिस तरह के स्टेटमेंट हम रोज पढ़ते आते हैं, जिस तरह के, मतलब ऑन बोथ द साइड्स, मतलब यहाँ किसी एक साइड की बात नहीं है, यहाँ पावर और एंटी एस्टेब्लिशमेंट की बात नहीं है। इट इज अबाउट द जनरल पॉलिटिक्स, इट इज अबाउट अ पार्टी इन पावर, इट इज ऑल्सो अबाउट अ पार्टी इन ऑपोजिशन. So his statement is actually on, yeah,
it's not an ideological look at politics, it is a literary look at politics in which he doesn't take sides with anyone but takes sides with ideas and
yeah,
manages to bring out the idiosyncrasies in all sides. So he is
yes,
very objective in his own way, right?
yeah.
तो
So
ये
I'll
मेरे
I'll
ख्याल से
I'll have a break
Oh,
here because there is a lot of Andi, Hututu, New Delhi Times that needs to be discussed. Ravan, but I think that
और
Mohit is here waiting for us, so we can.
मोहित आपसे कुछ सुनना चाहेंगे?
नहीं, मैं सिर्फ पहले मैं सोच रहा था कि मैं पोइट्री की तरफ जाऊंगा, क्योंकि पवन जी ने फिल्मों के सारे संदर्भ उठाए और विजुअल मीडिया वाले उठाए, लेकिन उससे पहले मैं सिर्फ ये कहना चाहूंगा कि सर का जो सबसे बड़ी बात है, एक तो जो आपने बिल्कुल सही बोली कि वो दोनों पक्ष देखते हैं, ऑब्जेक्टिवली हमेशा देखते हैं। दूसरी, वाकई उनकी वो एक उम्मीद जो है वो हर चीज़ में झलकती है, वो उनके पर्सोना में भी है, वो उनकी राइटिंग में भी है, और वो हमेशा बोलते हैं आई एम होपफुल, है ना। और लास्ट चीज़ वो जो दिखाते हैं वो बेबसी। वो एक इंटरव्यू में उन्होंने स्पेसिफिकली बोला था कि मैं एक बेबस शायर की हैसियत से सामने आता हूँ जब मैं इस तरह की बात लिखता हूँ। तो ऐसा नहीं है कि मैं आपको हेल्प नहीं करना चाहता, या क्योंकि क्वेश्चन जो पूछा था इंटरव्यूअर ने वो ये था कि आप कंफर्ट क्यों नहीं देते हैं अपनी शायरी, आप दर्द क्यों देते हैं इतना ज़्यादा, आप रुलाते क्यों हैं। तो उनका ये था कि मैं सिर्फ सच की बात करता हूँ और मैं खुद बेबस हूँ, मैं खुद आंसर ढूंढ रहा हूँ। ऐसा नहीं है कि मेरे पास आंसर है और मैं देना नहीं चाह रहा। तो इट इज़ लाइक दैट। उनका जो वो थॉट प्रोसेस है, वो कंसर्न जो है, वो आपको बियॉन्ड फिल्म्स अगर आप जाके देखेंगे तो उनकी पोइट्री में जिस लेवल पे मिलता है वो मतलब बियॉन्ड इमेजिनेशन है। मेरी वन ऑफ द मोस्ट फेवरेट पॉइंट से शुरू करता हूँ मैं।
मोहित, मुझे तुमने जो कहा ना, उससे मेरे को वो याद आ गया कि जलते हुए शहर में शायर, इससे ज्यादा करे क्या, अल्फाज से जख्म बढ़ते नहीं और नज्मों से खराशे बढ़ती नहीं, वो जो है ना,
बिल्कुल एग्जैक्टली।
सुनाओ तुम्हारी जो फेवरेट पॉइंट। या
जी, तो मैं यहाँ से शुरू करूंगा। 2-3 नज़में मैंने छांटी क्योंकि सर ने बहुत लिखा है। सब मतलब मजे की बात यह है कि इतना लिखा है लेकिन फिर भी कम पढ़ा गया है इस जेनरे में उनका। ये बहुत छोटी सी नज्म है टैटू के नाम से। अब आप देखिए, इसमें इमेजरी देखिए और मतलब आप पावर देखिए वर्ड्स की। उसने जाने क्यों अपने दाएं कंधे पर, उसने जाने क्यों अपने दाएं कंधे पर नील गाय का एक टैटू गुदवाया था। मर जाता कल दंगों में, अच्छे लोग थे गाय देख के छोड़ दिया।
वाह वाह।
आप ये देखिए कि 5 लाइन में उन्होंने आपका मतलब आप 47 से लेके आज तक की 2021 तक की हालत उन्होंने बयान कर दी है। आज भी बदला तो कुछ है ही नहीं, हम सब जानते हैं,
क्या
है ना। और इसी लेवल की एक और बहुत ही पसंदीदा नज्म है मेरी, सुल्ताना डाकू का आखिरी खत अपने बेटे के नाम। आप इसमें देखिए कि पॉलिटिकल, और मैं उनको पॉलिटिकल पोएट से ज्यादा ये बोलूंगा कि ही इज सोशली अवेयर पोएट, क्योंकि उन्होंने लगातार मतलब नॉट ओनली पॉलिटिक्स, मतलब उन्होंने जो सोसाइटी को के ऊपर उनकी नब्ज जो पकड़ी है सोसाइटी की, और वो इतने अवेयर रहते हैं, इतनी छोटी छोटी बात में से इतनी महीन चीज निकालते हैं. आप ये देखिए, सुल्ताना डाकू का आखिरी खत बेटे के नाम. जब तक सांस गले में थी 30 बरस तक बेटा मैंने चोरी की. छीन लिया जब चोरी करना मुश्किल था, खून किया जब छीना झपटी मुमकिन न थी. वो भी खत्म हुआ तो फिर सूली का फंदा पहन लिया. इतने ही सालों के बाद तुम्हारी बारी आएगी ये याद रहे. इतने ही सालों के बाद तुम्हारी बारी आएगी ये याद रहे. 6 साल के बच्चे पर लाजिम है बाप का पेशा सीखने से आगाज करे. सियासतदान से याद रखो पंगा न लेना, उसके बच्चे 5 बरस से सीखने लगते हैं. तो आप ये देखिए, आप स्टूडेंट पॉलिटिक्स की बात कर रहे थे, ये जिस तरीके से इस्तेमाल किए जाते हैं आपकी में, है ना?
Black humor is a black humor thing.
Yes, absolutely.
It is. और आप ये देखिए, जो मैं सोशली अवेयर होने की बात कर रहा था, इट्स नॉट ओनली अबाउट पॉलिटिक्स. आप एक और नज्म देखिए उनकी कि तिड़का कप. इतनी खूबसूरत तरीके से वो कमेंट करते हैं. तिड़का कप, तिड़का होता है जो टूटा हुआ, जिसमें हल्की सी दरार हो, या उस जो विच इज नॉट मुकम्मल, कंप्लीट नहीं है. तिड़का कप के जैसा था वो, उसका हैंडल था ही नहीं. इससे हम सब वाकिफ हैं जिन्होंने कप में चाय पी है. घर में कप के हैंडल टूटते ही हैं. तिड़का कप के जैसा था वो, उसका हैंडल था ही नहीं. कोई मुंह न लगाता था, लब जल जाते थे. हाथ में लो तो गर्म था, उंगलियां जलती थी. बॉस ने एक दिन बाहर फेंक दिया उसको. चल साला दलित, सबके चेहरे तिड़क गए हैं दफ्तर.
वाह.
तो ये जो आप देखिए कि किस तरीके से वो पकड़ते हैं बात को, और सिर्फ पॉलिटिक्स की बात नहीं करते हैं. ही इज मोर कंसर्न्ड अबाउट द सोसाइटी. और मतलब ये तो इतनी नज़में हैं उनकी. हाँ जी.
लेट मी पुट इट दिस वे, मोहित, कि आपने ये बात आपने प्रकट कर दिया. यू हैव ब्रॉट आउट द फैक्ट दैट ही वाज नॉट एन आइडियोलॉजिकल पोएट. ही इज नॉट एन आइडियोलॉजिकल पोएट, बट ही इज अ कॉन्शियस कीपर. मतलब
Yes.
एक जमीन की बात नहीं करते, जमीर की बात करते हैं. तो तो
अच्छा, मोहित ने एक बात कही, मुझे एक बहुत छोटी सी उनकी 3 लाइनें याद आ रही हैं. जो हुतुतु फिल्म में उनका एक कॉन्टेक्स्ट था दलित के ऊपर, क्योंकि हुतुतु फिल्म में जो लीड प्रोटोगनिस्ट था वो दलित लीडर था, जिसकी की एस्टेब्लिशमेंट से लड़ाई होती है. और सिर्फ ये 3 लाइनों में देखिए कितनी गजब की पोएट्री करते हैं वो. जब नाना पाटेकर कहते हैं कि हम तो गोबर के उपले हैं हम लोग सभी, हम तो गोबर के उपले हैं हम लोग सभी, इतिहास तले चुपचाप दहकते रहते हैं. हम तो गोबर के उपले हैं हम लोग सभी, इतिहास तले चुपचाप दहकते रहते हैं. एक बार कोई इतिहास के ढेर को हाथ लगा के देखे तो, छेड़ो तुम हमें, तब हम दिखाएंगे कि हम क्या हैं. मतलब हम चुपचाप हैं, हम साइलेंट हैं, लेकिन इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि मतलब हम लोग चुपचाप धीरे धीरे वो उस दौर में हमारा शोषण हो रहा है, बट हम लोग अभी चुपचाप हैं, लेकिन इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि तुम हाथ लगाओगे तो चुप रहेंगे. तो वो वहां से उस एक्टिविज्म की बात आती है.
बिल्कुल. इसमें इनफैक्ट पोएट की जो ऑर्थोडॉक्स डेफिनेशन है कि ही इज द वॉइस ऑफ द वॉइसलेस, इसमें बिल्कुल फिट होता है. You know, so that is true. अभी 1.5 मिनट ही बचा है. मुझे ऑलरेडी
मुझे लगता है इसका भी पार्ट 2 करना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि उस अभी जो सटायर वाला जो फेस है मुरारी लाल
पवन अनुराग से मेरी बातचीत हुई है इसके बारे में. महेंद्रा के हम चाहते हैं कि एक ही थीम पर कई सेशंस भी हो सकते हैं, ताकि 20 मिनट होती है, मगर इसका मतलब नहीं कि टॉपिक में गहराई में नहीं जाएंगे, तो गुलजारियत की महफिल जारी रहेगी. आई थिंक वी विल फाइंड. एंड मोहित की आवाज को तो मैंने मार्क कर लिया है कि मोहित हैज अ वंडरफुल सेंस ऑफ अटरेंस एंड एक्सप्लेनेशन, नैरेटिव स्टाइल. और पोएट्री को सुनाना ही नहीं, पोएट्री को एक्सप्लेन करना एक अलग अपने आप में एक आर्ट है जो मोहित के पास है, और पवन को एनालाइज करने की आर्ट है. सो आप दोनों को मैंने तो गिरफ्तार कर लिया है वैसे. तो उम्मीद है कि दूसरी सेशन जारी रहेगी. अब दूसरे लोग कमेंट भी कर सकते हैं, सवाल पूछ सकते हैं, बट आई थिंक what I liked
इसमें
about
5
today's
मिनट का एक्सटेंशन है ना अभी?
ये कर दिया हमने, उसके बाद हमारे पास सिर्फ 50 सेकंड है। मगर आज मैंने इसलिए मेंशन किया कि गिरफ्तारी जो है अनुराग भी अप्रूव करते हैं, इसलिए हम और सेशन उस पे जारी रहेंगे और सटायर पर अगले हफ्ते शायद बात करेंगे पवन, आपकी इजाजत से। और क्योंकि सारे जो नवरस हैं उस सब में लिखा हुआ है शायद गुलजार ने, शायद
एक्चुअली जब हम नदी में सैर करने जाते हैं ना तो 20 मिनट में तो वो टिकट विंडो पे टिकट भी नहीं खरीद पाते।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल, मगर ये गुलजार का एक्सप्रेस जो है वो ट्रेन है लंबा सा, अब स्लीपर क्लास के साथ जाएंगे हम अपन। तो थैंक यू वेरी मच। आज 1 मिनट लास्ट में मैंने वेस्ट किया ताकि टू कीप द कंटिन्यूटी अलाइव सो दैट टू नो दैट वी विल बी ऑन अगेन। Thank you all, and special thanks to Mohit, of course, Pawan.
Yes.
Good night, everybody. We'll be on.
Thank you. See you.